they're not overwhelmed. So the biggest mistake is to overwhelm a client, to try to get them to do things that they really can't do because their nervous system is not in the state which it allows that to happen. So that's a very common mistake of therapists trying to get clients to talk about their feelings, their emotions, or even some of their thoughts. Because one of the things that's been shown in trauma, or when a person is traumatized, is the part of the brain, Broca's area, that's involved in putting our feelings into language and communicating is shut down or is greatly diminished. So we really, really need to appreciate where the client is in terms of their physiological capacity. And that means the therapist has to be able to track the client. And in order to do that, the therapist needs to track their own sensations. And that then becomes the guiding post for the clients. And when the clients start to develop their own capacity to regulate themselves, become more and more comfortable with the inner experience of their bodies, then they're able to be in a more relational mode with the therapist. But if we try to do that too quickly, then it really can overwhelm the client. And trauma is about being overwhelmed, and that's the last thing you want to do. You don't want to recreate that.
Peter, could you say something about emotional trauma? Let me give you an example. I have a friend whose daughter was murdered, and she found out about this over the phone, and there was tremendous turmoil in her life, and it was experienced as a trauma. Would you treat this in a similar manner?
When a person hears some really bad news about somebody that they love, or they see something, it's really physically, it's like being hit, for example, in the stomach, or strangulated. And the therapist may want to try to work with the grief, but often you really can't access the grief because the person is caught in the shock reaction. It's like the wind was taken out of them. It's like their guts are tightened against being hit again with some kind of news like that, And when you are able to process that physiologically, physically, in the way that you see with Ray, then the person has access to their grief, to their sorrow. But very frequently, the physical part interferes with the processing of the grief. So yes, there's a good example, or a common example of how important it is to work with the physical, even with so-called emotional traumas.
As you mentioned earlier, Ray is a complex case, and it's pretty difficult to precisely track his physiological shifts and changes. If a therapist was much less experienced in this technique, where would they start with a client? How would they begin to use this technique, and what clients could they safely do that with?
Yeah. Well, okay. Again, you want to start with clients who are easier. You don't want to start necessarily with psychotic or borderline clients. You want to begin, and what I would suggest is if you do talk therapy, very often the person's body is telling a story that's rather different than the story they're telling with their words. There may be some relationship, but it can be quite different. And when you as a therapist perceive that, then sometimes bringing that to the attention of the client really takes them into a deeper story, or a deeper experience. Let me give you a simple example. Well, of course, it could be a shrugging of shoulder, it could be a momentary expression on the face, it could be a tightening of the neck, it could be a constricting of the breathing, or the opposite, it could be an expansion of the breath, an easing of the breath. So a lot of times if the therapist says, "Oh, I just noticed your breath seemed to be easier. Were you noticing that?" And then the client may say, "Oh yeah, I feel a lot more relaxed right now." And then the therapist might say, "Okay, well, it looks like your fingers are a little bit warmer," because they see the color changes from more of a blue to a pink. And then the client, again, can become aware of that. let me give you one example of a gesture which was critical in a therapy, a simple gesture which was critical in a therapy situation. I was working with a woman who was trapped on the 80th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And she's talking about her experience. And talking kind of a way to avoid the experience, which is okay. I mean, I let her talk and I listen. And then after a while, she makes a gesture just like this, just for a moment. And then I say, well, just notice that, just notice that. And she puts her hand down. I said, no, it's okay, not to stop it, but to just notice what it feels like when you hold your hand like this. And then, I encourage the person again to take their time to slow it down. Then all of a sudden she goes, oh, that's what it is. When the plane hit, the wall at the other side of my office came towards me, and I was trying to protect myself from it. Now, I mean, obviously that's not going to protect the person from something like this, but that's what our instincts do. When something comes towards us, whether it's an object or somebody who we don't want to be close to us, or somebody who wants to do us harm, our body does something like this to try to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves. When a person can feel that, and feel the energy and the strength and the power of that, then they get the sense, well, wait a minute, I'm not completely helpless. I am able to defend myself. I am able to set limits, to set boundaries. Sometimes therapists will try with clients to little avail to try to get them to set boundaries. However, if the client first experiences it at the physical level, then they're able to very often make those changes in their behaviors in a much stronger way. So those are simple kinds of things that therapists can do. To be aware that the body is telling a story which may be quite different than the verbal story. And generally, when you work this way, as the session proceeds, the person's body starts to be making a similar story as their words. That's when you're starting to get a coherence in the narrative, verbally and somatically.